I grew up in this little town called North Hatley up in Canada, a beautiful little place nestled on the northern shores of Lake Massawippi. And it's got some really grand houses, the kind of places doctors and lawyers from Montreal like to spend their summers. And for the first 7 years of my life, it was a privilege to live in such a peaceful, picturesque place. And then, the day after my 7th birthday, a lady I'd never seen before in my life tried to murder me. So this was in the summer of 1957. All the boats were out on the lake, and me and my friends were playing out in my family's front yard. None of the smaller lakeside houses had backyards, and instead had docks and jetties which stretched out into the water. But then whoever built them figured that they ought to have front lawns too, so front lawns they got. It had been a real scorcher of a day, so me and my buddies had been alternating between jumping off the dock at the back of our house and running around the front yard in our swimming trunks. The lake path was just feet away, but folks always drove down it nice and slow, and being in such a small town, the people driving past would sometimes wave to us because everyone knew everyone in those days. Now anyways, we're playing in the front yard, running around playing tag or whatever it was, when we spot a car coming down the road towards us. Now naturally, we're curious as to who it is, so we start lollygagging not far from the edge of the road to watch it approach. Sometimes we'd recognize people by their cars and sometimes not, especially in the summertime when all the tourists were in town. And the same was true for this car, a pale green Dodge Regent that didn't ring any bells for us. We watched it sort of trundling towards us, expecting it to keep the same low speeds, but as it got closer, it started to speed up. As the Regent's engine started to roar, I started to back up, and I guess it was out of pure instinct, in which case it was pure instinct which saved my life. Because backing up gave me, all three of us really, the head start that we needed to get the heck out of the way when that Regent veered onto the grass and came barreling towards us. We screamed as we ran for cover, hearing that thing coming up behind us at what must have been 60 to 70 miles per hour. If the driver hadn't been blind drunk, she might have had the motor skills to turn that wheel enough to hit us. But she was, so after careening right past us, she smashed into the tree in the front yard of old Mr. Finster next door. Now we assumed it had to have been an accident, and a terrible one at that, because the poor lady really did smash into that tree. She obliterated that poor Regent and gave herself some pretty serious injuries by the looks of things too, because when she got out of that car, she had blood all down her face and blouse. She looked young, younger than my mom, but older than my eldest sister, and I remember she was pretty too. And I also remember one of my buddies shouting, "Lady, lady, are you okay?" You know, the kind of dumb rhetorical question people ask when someone is clearly not okay. And I guess I didn't know what to expect from her at the time. I didn't know whether she'd give us a thumbs up and an A-okay or drop down dead right there. But what I definitely wasn't expecting was this bloodied, battered young woman to lock eyes with me and for her eyes to have this look of pure hatred in them. That was probably the most scared I've ever been in my life at that point, like something from a nightmare, but it was nothing to what came next. We only locked eyes for a matter of a second, but it felt like much longer, and that elastic moment only ended once the lady started stumbling around to the Regent's passenger seat. Suddenly, I heard a lady behind me yell, "Oh my God!" I turned to look, and saw one of our neighbors in the big houses on the other side of the road had come out of her house and was looking on in horror at what I believed was the stumbling lady in her wrecked car. That's not what scared her so much, she yelled out, because when I turned back to the wrecked car, I saw the injured lady dragging a gun from the passenger seat. I didn't know it at the time because I thought all guns were rifles and couldn't conceive of the fact that that lady only had 2 shells in what was a long double-barrel shotgun. So when she pulled it from her car and shakily aimed it towards me, I just thought, I'm dead. It didn't matter that her first shot missed because as me and my buddies ran screaming towards our house, I thought that lady'd keep on shooting till she got us. But of course, she only had one more shot, so she lowered the shotgun and came scrambling across the grass towards us. Nobody was home at my place, My mom and older sister had gone for a walk, and they'd told us, but we hadn't heard. And that's something I'm very thankful for in retrospect, because I hate to think what would have happened if my mom or sister opened the door and gave the crazy lady a shot on all 4 or 5 of us. And since we saw her getting closer to us, we ran from the front door and towards the dock to get away from her. It was pretty much the only option available to us at the time, so we ran and we kept on running, expecting another shot to come at any moment. But it didn't. Not until we dived into the water, by which point it was this semi-muted blam coming from behind us above the water's surface. Now, I was sure that I'd been shot. I just couldn't feel it for some reason. But as I stopped for a moment near the sandy bottom and checked my legs and back, there weren't any wounds, and although I was still too scared to surface for quite some time, it was only when I ran out of breath that I returned to the surface, and after taking a huge lungful of air, I saw one of our neighbors successfully wresting the shotgun from that lady's hands. He tossed it in the water, and then went about taking the lady down to the wooden deck before he asked if anyone was hurt. Thankfully, we were all fine, but the lady was screaming up an absolute storm. She was already hurt from the crash, and whatever happened to her was made a lot worse by our neighbor throwing her down onto the wooden decking. He then started yelling at us to go get someone, but we weren't even out of the water before someone else showed up carrying a rifle, unaware that the lady had already been disarmed and taken down. Our neighbor yelled at him to go call the cops, and then the man with the rifle went back the way that he came. Our neighbor, still pinning the lady to the deck, told us to get the hell back to the house and out of sight, and we were all so frightened of the hysterical way that she was behaving that we did just that. We walked around the house so all we could hear were her screams, and then watched and waited until the police showed up to drag the lady away. When my mom got back, she was hysterical too. I mean, you can see it from her perspective. No sooner does she head out for a walk with my sister, but some crazy lady shows up to try and run me and my friends down and shoot us. She felt terrible for not having been there to protect us when, really, we were all damn lucky that she and my sisters weren't there, because that crazy lady hadn't chosen to go after me and my friends just for the heck of it. In fact, she wasn't targeting my friends at all. She was after me, and incidentally my older sisters, and it's a miracle no one but her was hurt. When the cops got her back to the station and she slept off her booze, the lady sang like a canary and answered every question the cops had. She told them how she and my dad had been having an affair, and that he'd promised to run away with her and leave his wife and kids, us, behind. But then one day, he changed his mind and decided he was better off where he was. This infuriated the lady that he was cheating with, so much so that she threatened to murder his family. But my dad's response, "Psh, no you will not." She told him that she was deadly serious, no pun intended here, but he still didn't think that she'd actually go through with it. But this made her even angrier, and less than a week later, she got drunk on her father's alcohol, took a shotgun, and then rode his car across town to do the deed before she lost the stomach for it. And that's what I mean when I talk about how lucky we were, because if she wasn't drunk and she hadn't crushed her car and smashed her head against the steering wheel, I might very well not be around to write this. At first, the police officers only told my father the reasons why that lady tried to kill us, and he didn't see fit to tell my mother the full story. But as you can imagine, it was only a matter of time before she found out what really happened that day, and it caused the largest fight my parents have ever had, and coincidentally, it was the final one they ever had too. As a short while later, Mom took us south of the border to the United States, and the 4 of us, me, Mom, and my 2 sisters, lived in New York City for a number of years before Mom remarried and went to live on Long Island with our stepdad. We only got the full story of what happened next some years later, how the crazy lady went to jail, how my dad ended up drinking himself to death when it finally hit him that he'd almost got us all killed. I know it wasn't exactly his fault that the lady went nuts and was out for blood, but I imagine the whole thing would have been avoided if he'd just, I don't know, kept it in his pants. and sometimes I think about my dad and what it must have been like in the final days of his life. I wonder if the memories of his greed and pride were torturing him, or if he'd found just the right cocktail of booze to numb the pain enough to slip away without a single cogent moment of regret. I try not to feel too bad for him, though, because I know there's an alternate timeline where he's drinking himself to death and feeling oh so sorry for himself next to 4 freshly filled graves, mine, my mom's, and my 2 sisters. Hey Joel, my name's Kieran and I'm from Glasgow. And when he was still with us, my old granddad, God rest his soul, told me a story that I think you'll enjoy reading. He moved to Glasgow back in the 40s when he was still a teenager, so his dad could work in the munitions factory since the war was on. But he grew up in this little coastal village called Strone. The name comes from the Scottish Gaelic for nose, and if you look at Strone on a map, the peninsula that Strone is situated on really does look like a big old schnauzer. But don't let the name fool you, because I visited Strone with my granddad and it really is beautiful. But it's also a place with a very dark secret, albeit a very open secret these days, and one my granddad let me in on one day after a few too many drums of whiskey. And so back in the 1900s, before World War I, Strone was exactly what it is now, just smaller. It's this charming wee village with nary a care in the world, full of smiley, happy people who all said hello when they passed each other on the shore road. There's a beautiful golf course that the town sort of sandwiches, so Strone would get all kinds of bigwigs and wealthy types coming through and making the cafe and pub owners very happy, lightening their pockets. Everything's going wonderfully. The police constable has nothing to do but stroll around whistling to himself, until one day when the town's post office suddenly burns down. And in doing so, it unleashes a scandal of what at the time was considered epic proportions. The post office was first spotted ablaze just after sunset in October, and although the townsfolk fought bravely to douse the flames, the post office burned to the ground overnight. Fearing the postmaster and his 2 assistants to be victims of the blaze, the village constable enlisted 2 trusted men in sifting through the rubble. Then when he was finished, he announced both good and bad news. The good news was that no human remains had been located among the ashes, meaning the postmaster and his assistants were no doubt still alive. The bad news, on the other hand, was that they appeared to have absconded with over £1,000 belonging to the town's post office savings bank. The trio consisted of the postmaster, a Mr. Dalgish, who was a middle-aged bachelor, and 2 spinsters, Mrs. Robertson and Mrs. Mackenzie. Since none had any family in the village, it stood to reason that they'd be inclined to abscond. But the village was still shocked to its absolute core, as it constituted the town's most high-profile crime since the 1700s, when a gang of smugglers murdered the village officer while bringing goods to shore. At a village church service one Sunday, the vicar invited the town's policeman to address his congregation. Constable McAllister announced that he was doing everything he could to bring the trio to justice and return the stolen money. He was even working in conjunction with police forces in Glasgow and Belfast, and that officers in Glasgow believed that they were hot on the trio's trail. Not even a week later, Constable McAllister had more good news for the congregation. Police had raided a home in Clydebank, believing it to be the missing trio's safe house, and by the looks of things, Dalglish, Robertson, and Mackenzie had fled just minutes prior, but they left behind a large bag of banknotes. The post office savings money had been recovered. Now naturally, the money's return was the cause of much celebration around Strone, celebrations the pub landlords were only too happy to facilitate for their own financial gain. But it was all a lie. The truth didn't come out for another 25 years, not until one of the men who helped Constable McAllister sift through the rubble of the post office was on his deathbed. Constable McAllister himself had long since passed away following a short but valiant battle against an aggressive cancer, and had resigned to take the secret to his grave. Yet one of the men he trusted to do the same eventually proved he could not. He was said to have expressed a deep remorse at helping tarnish the good names of two innocent women in Mrs. Mackenzie and Mrs. Robertson, because not only had they not been involved in any kind of plot to rob the post office's savings, there had been no such theft at all. According to him, this is the true story of what happened the morning after the fire. Having been up most of the night trying to put out the fire, most of the village was still asleep during the dawn hours. This gave Constable McAllister and his two hand-picked men plenty of time to comb through the ashes of the post office alone, which is how they found the bones of the postmaster along with his two assistants. The men were obviously bemused as why the trio hadn't escaped once they realized there was a fire. The post office was a relatively small building, so it's likely they noticed something burning fairly quickly. But upon examining the post office's two doors, they discovered both had been locked tight. And not only that, but the keys appeared to have been in the clothing of the postmaster himself. Since the scene didn't make any sense, the constable asked his two pals to keep watch over it while he gained access to the postmaster's home. He intended on searching his home for clues to what had happened. He didn't have to look past the kitchen, though. On the table, Postmaster Dalglish had left an extensive handwritten note describing exactly why he'd chosen to lock himself and his two assistants in the post office before personally setting it on fire. And the note was long and rambling, but the essence was this. Dalglish believed his two assistants were, as he phrased it, no longer who they claimed to be. He claimed they posed a significant threat to the people of Strone, as well as the wider world, and since their power meant that they could not be outmatched in a head-on confrontation, Dalglish explained that he had no choice but to use the only means available to him. He would suddenly lock the post office, set it on fire, then keep the two beings, the word he used, from escaping before they died from smoke inhalation. McAllister later told one of the men guarding the post that it was the single most disturbing thing he'd seen put to page, the ramblings of a madman. And if word spread of what the postmaster had done, there was no telling how it'd affect the village and its people. And as I mentioned earlier, a big portion of the village's income came from the nearby golf course, and if the wealthy stopped patronizing it while staying in the village hotels and drinking in the village pubs, then it'd have a terrible effect on its economy. There was also the matter of reputation, something which was far more important back then than it is now. These days, people are all about exposing and talking and therapizing, but back then, and I hope you don't mind if I try to coin a phrase, but a stiff upper lip was valued far, far higher than a wobbly lower one. But above all, Constable McAllister knew that having such a terrible murderous insanity visit Strone would have an indelible effect on its people for generations to come. There'd be rumors of hauntings, the story would traumatize children, and all kinds of penny dreadful journalists would come slithering around, poking their snouts into places they didn't belong. And so, Constable McAllister made what you might call an executive decision and covered everything up, sacrificing the reputations of the deceased for the reputation of the village. A dying man spoke his piece and the secret was out, but since it was only spoken around a few choice relatives, it didn't exactly spread like wildfire. Instead of spreading overnight, it took years of quiet whispers for the truth to spread, and even then, many dismissed it as a ghastly rumor spread by bored school children. But my granddad, on the other hand, he swore by it. He said that one night, in the year before his family moved themselves to Glasgow, someone dug up Mrs. Mackenzie's grave in the middle of the night. It must have taken them all bloody night to do so, but I don't think they neglected to fill the grave back in or put the lid back on the coffin through lack of time. It was to prove that the grave of old Mrs. Mackenzie, whose remains were supposed to have been buried after perishing in the post office fire, was empty. I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s in rural Minnesota, and I guess in a lot of ways, my childhood was a lot like any other kids out there on the plains. Now, I watched a lot of TV, went to church with my family wherever we could, and me and my brother even had ourselves a Commodore 64. But then, since we grew up in what could only be described as a strict and very insular religious cult, TV consisted of purely faith-based programming. Whenever we could meant every day and twice on Sundays, and even our Commodore games had to be scripture-based as nothing remotely secular was permitted. And the best way I can describe it, it was like living in a bubble. Or maybe more like a snow globe in the winter times. Now, we were part of one group and then another, and then one day, we were on our own and with just my grandpa to shepherd the faithful, which comprised of my own family and a handful of others living on a remote farm complex. Life revolved around the Bible and farm work, and we started mornings at 5:30 a.m. with communal prayers in the big old barn the men had painted black and repurposed as a chapel. And we prayed to God to protect us through the impending end times, but then if someone got sick, we dedicated a lot of prayer time to them. And boy did we need to, because my grandpa called us to reject all forms of modern medicine in favor of purely spiritual healing. Now, he called it the devil's crutch, and that a person who utilized it was wearing their lack of faith like a badge of honor. And it's two such incidents which shaped my belief system growing up, one for better and one for worse. I remember the winter my little brother came down with something that I now realize was probably pneumonia. We prayed day and night while my grandpa laid hands on him, trying to draw out the demons that so plagued his body. We even fasted for a whole day, as penitence and flagellation were believed to be very powerful methods of what grandpa called expiation, but which I came to understand was punishing oneself before God. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, just anointing oil and spoken prayer around his body, and then when he pulled through, Grandpa declared it a miracle. Now, looking back, it was probably just sheer luck that my brother survived his bout of illness, and we were indescribably happy that he had. But not every child survived the winters, and I remember attending not one, but 2 winter funerals before the age of 10, where the coffins laid to rest were heartbreakingly small. Now, we didn't report any births or deaths to the county, and I'm pretty sure Grandpa found a way for us to avoid paying taxes, too. I know we had money, but aside from things that they could use to indoctrinate us children, we tried to avoid any kind of luxuries, especially modern ones. We did a lot of bartering with nearby farms, and my dad's generation was the last to have things like birth certificates or social security numbers. Outsiders were considered worldly, which, contrary to what the word actually means, was not a good thing to us on the farm. The faithless were to be pitied and evangelized from afar, but never trusted or mingled with. Our little cloister had to be absolute, so there was no public schools, no trips into town without strict supervision, and no friends beyond the kids from the other families who lived with us. Daily life was a mix of joy and fear. Summers meant berry picking and swimming in the creek, with bonfires where we'd sing and share testimonies of faith. But all that was to distract us from the fact that we were right in the middle of the end times, and the outside world was about to crumble in Satan's grip. Winters were harsh, huddled around wood stoves or memorizing scripture by flashlight whenever the generators were on the fritz. You think Christmas time might be an excuse to live a little, but Grandpa declared it to be co-opted by the greed of the faithless. We got together on Christmas to have dinner and pray together, but the rest was spent in the big black chapel, praying in thanks for the birth of our Lord and Savior. And I find it strange when people these days talk about the 90s, in the sense that outsiders had this shared sense of culture, or what the Germans might call Zeitgeist, or spirit of the times. They talk about Seinfeld, VHS tapes, and MTV, but for me, it was like watching through a cracked fence. We'd catch glimpses of the first Gulf War on the TV, which was terrifying for us because Grandpa considered it as further evidence that we were living through the end times. He said all those tanks and soldiers would soon be turned on us, and by a government that didn't just reject God, but embrace Satan and all his demons. The internet was a way to spy on us. Ruby Ridge and Waco were further proof of a government that hated us. And then forget about Y2K, which was Grandpa's favorite sermon subject for about 3 months straight. We drilled in preparation of government raids, hiding in root cellars with weapons close at hand, to the point that when people talk about life back in the 50s, when fear of Russian A-bombs were at their highest, I think, sounds awfully familiar, actually. But now, since I've told you about the event which confirmed my faith, my brother surviving his illness, allow me to tell you about the one which destroyed it. Not long before my 15th birthday, during the fall of 1997, my grandma was making dinner for my grandpa when she suddenly attacked him with a knife for what Grandpa claimed was no earthly reason whatsoever. Looking back on it, I think he said something to her, something which finally drove her over the edge and filled her with a murderous rage. I don't know exactly what that thing was, and it's obviously pure speculation on my part, but whatever it was that happened that day, it sent my grandma into a frenzy. I saw her myself as a group of menfolk dragged her off to the chapel, her home in hospice for the next several weeks, and she was well and truly beside herself. She was kicking and fighting, screaming and hollering, and I only recognized her by the dress that she was wearing too, because the men marching her off to the chapel had to wrap a cloth around her head to keep her from biting them. It was horrifying to watch, and all I could do was run to my mother to ask her what was going on. At the time, she didn't know, and it was only later that she came to tell me. Grandma had been possessed by a demon. Now, watching my hysterical grandmother dragged away to be shackled to a bed in the old chapel was beyond horrifying to me. And so it might come as a surprise to some of you that I was actually very optimistic in the days that followed. I believed wholeheartedly that Grandma would be fine because not only did she have my grandpa at her side day and night, laying hands on her and reciting scripture, but she had everyone on the farm praying to God on her behalf. We couldn't use the old barn-turned-chapel anymore, and not since Grandma had taken up residence there. But on Grandpa's direction, we prayed in our homes instead and begged God's forgiveness so that he might cast the demons out of Grandma. Now, I had no doubt in my mind that it'd all work. After all, it had worked when my brother was sick. But over time, Grandma didn't seem to be getting better at all, and instead, she only got worse. She slept mostly during the daytime, so school and morning prayers were mostly quiet. But at nighttime, when she woke up, we could hear her screams from our homes. They weren't loud, as the barn was quite a distance away from the residential buildings, but they were always there, lingering in the background after dark, and they'd last until Grandma either lost her voice or passed out around dawn. I didn't find this out until much later on because they didn't tell us kids everything. But one morning, Grandpa came back from tending to Grandma all night, looking pale and deflated. He normally came back tired, but content and confident of Grandma's recovery. But that morning, he seemed anything but. He told my dad, his son-in-law, that he'd come to learn of something during the night, something which terrified him. And I apologize in advance for the theology lesson, but it'll help you understand why Grandpa was so terrified. So, Leviathan is a real scary dude. It's supposedly one of the demon princes of hell, which is a badass title if ever there was one, and in the Bible he's described as having impenetrable scales, so basically invincible, and it also has the ability to breathe fire like a dragon, even though it likes to dwell in the ocean. Make that make sense, I guess. But that means, from a purely fundamentalist Christian perspective, Leviathan is the very last demon prince that you'll want to be invaded by. His impenetrable scales make it very hard to dislodge him from a host's body, and his breath of fire denotes an extremely corrosive effect on said host. But then, again, some of you might be surprised at how happy Grandpa was when he realized this. You see, he had no doubt in his mind that God would grant him the power to defeat Leviathan. After all, he was on the righteous path. But what's more, the Bible prophesies that the torturous serpent, denoting Leviathan, will be served up to the righteous during the end of days. Basically, Grandpa believed God was granting him the opportunity to defeat the demon prince Leviathan, serve it up to the righteous, and bring about the end of days. Obviously, in this context, end of days simply refers to the rapture, which, from a fundamentalist Christian perspective, is like the best thing ever, I guess. And so now you understand why Grandpa was so terrified when he realized Grandma wasn't getting better. It wasn't just that he was losing her, it's that if Leviathan really was about to claim his wife's soul, it was because God had deemed him unworthy of the honor and had promptly deserted him. And if God had deserted him, then he'd deserted us all. I obviously wasn't privy to this information, but I felt Grandpa's fear. We all did. We heard it in his sermons. We read it in the lines on his face after those late nights praying at his screaming wife's bedside. But above all, we felt it when he had us encircling the barn, man, woman, and child, to pray aloud for Grandma's mortal soul. She screamed and wailed throughout that whole affair, yelling things like, "He's the devil, you need to get out, get far away from here." And at the time, we thought they were the words of a demon prince. And now, I think they might have been the sanest words to grace my ears in all my young life. And when we were done praying, we all went back home to pray some more before dinner. We ate in silence, trying not to hear the screams as that monster I called a grandpa resorted to quite literally trying to beat the devil out of my poor suffering grandmother. And finally, after weeks of waiting and worrying, my parents told me it was time to wish Grandma goodbye. We all lined up outside the barn and went inside in our 2s and 3s, and it was quiet by then. Grandma was too weak to scream anymore, and so after we shuffled up to the grubby old mattress that she was lying on, she didn't say a word. She was looking at us, but I don't think she saw us, you know. I think Grandpa might have done something to her head, and I don't know what, but something bad. All she did was take shallow breaths and stare at us blankly as we said our tearful goodbyes and then walked out of that barn. Grandpa stood watch the whole time, looking empty-eyed and defeated. He was a man who'd failed, a man whose God had deserted him, and it ended up being the end of him. After Grandma passed away and we held a little funeral for her after laying her to rest in our secret cemetery, Grandpa went into a period of deep prayer. The chapel stayed off limits as Grandpa would head inside every day and kneel by the side of that old mattress to pray for Grandma's soul. At least, that's what we thought he was doing. But looking back on it, I think it was more like he was going there to starve himself and reflect on what he'd done with his life. He lost weight, his sermons got shorter, and we'd see him out of the chapel less and less and less, until one day, I heard that he got up early in the morning, wandered off into the woods, and was never seen again. My dad, who took over his duties as his male heir, claimed that he must have been taken by the angels to go be with Grandma. I don't know exactly what had happened to him personally, but I can hazard a guess. Once he was gone, things stayed the same for a little while, but with my dad at the helm, things started to get much more lax around the farm. One big contributing factor was our need for an attorney, and someone had the bright idea to groom one of us kids as the farm's pro bono attorney after pitching in to put us through college. Well, since the oldest and smartest kid was me, I'm not bragging, I'm just saying, I was picked to be the farm's undercover agent in the outside world. Get educated, become an attorney, come home and defend the farm. And this was their plan anyway, but needless to say, it didn't work out. If seeing what they did to Grandma planted the seed of doubt in my mind, going to college poured a whole bunch of water all over it. I had to pick a private Christian college. I couldn't pick anywhere, but transitioning from a fundamental Christian homeschool environment to an actual college just tore my whole worldview apart. I still believe in God, in a manner of speaking anyway, but at college I encountered all kinds of Gnosticism, Mandaism, and Manichaeism, and it had me questioning everything, not just what I'd been told by Grandpa and my parents. Then the more I realized I'd been taught a lie, the more I realized my grandma hadn't simply passed away. She'd been murdered. And I entered a period of deep, clawing depression, not just because my entire worldview had collapsed, but because it was too late to bring my grandpa to justice. The only thing that gave me even the smallest flicker of hope was the idea that my parents, along with the others who'd kept Grandma starved and confined to the chapel, could taste a small portion of that same justice. I was planning on cutting them off anyway, at least until I could find it in my heart to forgive them what they'd done to me. But when I called the cops in that area and told them all about what had happened with my grandma, I knew that they'd do more to rubber stamp that family divorce than anything I could possibly think of. The cops paid them a visit, asked some questions, and concluded that there was very little chance of gaining any convictions, given the man with all the answers was now deceased. I figured that was the case, so I wasn't too disappointed, but the tension I felt when my parents' letters started appearing in my school mailbox was on another level. I had to deny it was me. I couldn't come clean until I'd finished my education, and I actually didn't come entirely clean until I'd saved enough money to pay my college back and could walk away from my family with only a small souvenir of guilt. I just wish I had the ladyballs to do it in person, because when it came time to confess my attempt to get them arrested, I could only bring myself to do it by letter. I didn't have to fear the flurry of correspondence that would have come if I hadn't added a little postscript, one which detailed me moving someplace they'd never, ever find me, but I sometimes imagine how furious my father was. But furious or not, he cashed that check, and with that, I bought my freedom. As I said earlier, I still believe in God, just not in any sense my grandpa would ever sanction. I honor my mother and father by praying for them, not every night, but most nights. I don't know if they've seen the error of their ways or even if that old farm still exists anymore. I just know I can't be friendly with a man who had a hand in the murder of his own beloved mother. I can't tell you my name or where exactly I am currently, but know that I am a young woman who grew up in a small Siberian village called Pashinya. Pashinya was home to around 500 people, families who had been there for generations. We had a difficult time living from the land while the rest of Russia seemed to rush past ahead of us in politics and technology. Winters were terrible, with temperatures dropping as low as negative 40 degrees Celsius or even lower. Snow would pile up so high that we would have to make tunnel paths between the houses. We would burn wood or coal in our stoves to stay warm, and cars had to be left running all night sometimes just to keep the engines from freezing. Summer was better, much better, but there were still things which made it hard, like the middle of summer where there was daylight for almost a week, or the swarms of mosquitoes that plague us at night and leave us with bites. But summer also gave us the chance to gather berries or fish in the rivers, because even during the easier times of the year, our lives revolved around survival. As the oldest daughter in a family of 5 children, I helped Mama with household chores from a very young age. I would help milk the cow, feed the chickens, and I would help chop firewood too. And this was a very important part of our lives because the only heating that we had came from a traditional Russian stove made of bricks. Once the sun had risen, we would bake bread and make kasha, a kind of buckwheat porridge, for our breakfast. Our school was a one-room building a few kilometers away, and we were taught math, Russian literature, and history. But that history was simply a mix of Soviet propaganda and horror stories from the early 90s when everything fell apart after perestroika. And after school, I'd help tend the vegetable garden in summer or mend clothes by candlelight in winter. Meals were simple: potatoes, cabbage, pickled mushrooms from the forest, and whatever meat Papa could hunt or trade for. My grandmother, a tough babushka who survived Stalin's era, taught me embroidery and herbal remedies and told us how life was better when Papa Yosef was in charge. We didn't have much, and we didn't get internet until 2011, and even then only at the community center. But since electricity was unreliable, blackouts were common, especially in remote areas, so sometimes there was no TV or radio at all. As a teenager, seeing pictures and videos online made me long for life in a big city like Novosibirsk or even Moscow, where a girl could study or find a job. But for Siberian children like me, opportunities in those places were few and far between. Little did I know, but one day I would get my wish. But we have a saying in Russia, one that I hear is very similar to an English phrase: be wary of your desire. One night, in the winter of 2022, the village was awoken by the sound of a very large and very loud explosion. The boom of the explosion woke everybody up, but it sounded very distant as it was so high in the sky. But then, the shock wave hit us, making everything rattle and shake, and you could hear the sound of children crying in their beds all over the village. I called out to my papa to ask him what was going on. He said he didn't know as he put on his boots and clothes and then ran out into the snow to look up into the sky. We all did, some not even bothering to put on shoes or overcoats. And when he looked up into the sky, we saw it. There was a huge fireball, so large I would never have imagined it possible had I not seen it with my own eyes, and it lit up the sky like hell itself had replaced the clouds. We all stood there watching as the flames burned out, churning out smoke so thick it blocked out the moon. And then, the first pieces of debris started falling to earth. It was just small pieces at first that pitter-pattered off the roof of our homes like raindrops, but then the larger pieces started to hit the ground too, and those did not sound so pleasant, especially not the pieces that screamed as they burned. We had to take cover in our homes as pieces of whatever had exploded above us smashed into our houses. It was the most scared I had ever been in my life, and my mother and father used their own bodies to shield us as large pieces of metal began smashing into the house. I have a memory of my father rushing to soak a blanket in water before throwing it over a piece of flaming debris that had smashed through our roof. He stopped our home from burning to the ground, but others were not so lucky. 8 people lost their lives that night, and almost twice the amount of homes burned to the ground. In the morning, we looked outside and gasped at the destruction. We were used to taking care of ourselves, so we did not expect any help from the local government, not for weeks or even months anyway. So when a large number of soldiers arrived that very same day, we were all very happy. But they were not there to help us. Not really. And the first thing that they did was tell us to stop attempting to clean up and repair our homes. They were not there to help us rebuild our homes. They had arrived to take us away from them. They explained it was too dangerous to stay there, and that if we joined them at a camp that they had arranged for us, they could feed us and treat our wounded until it was safe to return again. This we welcomed much more readily, and the army were true to their word as conditions at the camp were good. Their medics treated our wounded, and we were all interviewed by the same pair of officers who were very sympathetic and consoling in their questioning. We had suffered a terrible tragedy, and they simply wanted to figure out what had happened. They also assured us that our home would be rebuilt, and we'd be able to return as soon as it was safe to do so. But this was just one of the many lies to us, and soon it became clear that something strange was going on. Apart from a few particular incidents, we were never treated poorly by the soldiers or their officers, but they did make it clear that the additional medical examinations that we were subjected to were not voluntary. People who had cuts, bruises, or broken bones treated were being dragged back into the medical tents to have their blood drawn and their bodies examined. This happened to everybody too, not just those that had been hurt by the falling debris, and it happened again and again and again. They were testing for something, and they would not tell us what they were testing for. And after weeks of this, of living in tents and eating military food, there was a small rebellion in the camp, and we demanded to be able to return to our homes. The high-ranking officers told us that that area had not been repaired and rebuilt yet, so it was not safe for us to return, but we were sick of being told this. My dad said repairs would take no more than a week at most if everybody shared the work, but Army engineers had supposedly been working on it for 3 weeks and with nothing to show for it. In the end, the high-ranking officers told us that they would figure something out, and we took this to mean that they were returning us to Pashinya. Instead, they announced that we were being moved to a suburb outside Moscow called Mutishi. After a journey of many days by train and road, we arrived at our new home, a towering apartment block surrounded by many others just like it. But once closer, we saw ours was much different. There was a fence and guards. Medical facilities had been set up on the bottom floor, although we were supposedly free to come and go. A person needed a series of military approvals to do so, which made things impossible for people who wanted to leave. And the same routine played out for us. More military food, more medical tests, and more interviews with different officers about what we saw in the sky that night. And I told them the same story over and over: explosion, fireball, debris, then terror. And there was nothing more I could tell them, because that was all I knew. But still, they asked me many questions, like they were waiting for me to say something that would finally satisfy them. Now, for weeks, we were told that Pashinya was finally being rebuilt after the engineers had cleared away all the rubble and debris, but even when they said it was finished, they still found reasons to keep us in that apartment block. My father applied for a leaver's permit again and again and again, and then over and over he was told, "No, you have not the right paper," or "No, you did not complete this paper properly," and had to go back to start again. I remember my mother crying one night and asking if we could ever get to leave that place. And then one day, my father came back to our apartment with a big smile on his face and told us we were leaving. I only found out later, but my father told me that he had found 2 guards doing something that they shouldn't have. He didn't say exactly what that thing was, only that they would be in a lot of trouble if their officers found out what they were doing. The 2 soldiers asked my father what he wanted in order to keep quiet. Apparently, we were too special to simply murder to keep us quiet, and he told them he wanted to leave with his family. My mother was terrified. She believed it was a trick and that the soldiers would murder him. But it was no trick. Their word was true, and the next time my father applied for a leaving permit, it was granted. We were only the 3rd family to be permitted to leave the apartment block, and when my father met with the father of another family, he was warned that things were not over for us. The man was working as a garbage collector to earn enough money to travel back to Pashinya, as the government would not give him the money themselves for him to travel. Another sign that they did not want us to return. But that was not all. He realized that whenever he left the apartment that they were renting for just a few rubles a week, he was being followed. Sometimes by 2 men in a car, and sometimes by 1 man just walking, but he was certain of it. Papa said that then he made a decision that he would leave Russia and seek asylum in another country. I can't tell you which country this is for reasons of personal safety, but we were very happy to be granted a hearing based on claims of medical experimentation. Papa said the person he talked to from the government here was appalled when they heard about what we had all been through, and Papa even spoke to another man from the government who asked more questions about the explosion. We've been waiting for our application to be processed for a long time now, but we are very sure that asylum will be granted to us. Sometimes I worry it will not, and we will be forced to live in another place for another long time while we wait once more, just like in the camp and the apartment. But this is only my 2nd biggest fear, returning to Russia. My first is what will happen if